Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. For all the people who have the luxury of watching us, great haircut.
Haircut.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Looking good.
Yeah, in fact, I got a really bad haircut and then I had to go get it fixed. So
I've had that happen before.
yeah. No, I got this haircut because I was going to jury duty and I had to look respectable.
Was jury duty okay?
Jury duty's okay. It's not quite done, but we'll see if I get selected for the jury.
Cool. Shall we get into some Biden?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. So there are actually a few pieces that all kind of come together about Biden. Maybe we could start with your piece about his plan that came out to a lot of controversy. And you think there are some things that he's right about and some things that he's wrong about, or you suggest that he would do them in a different way. Why don't you start by giving kind of the high level overview, and then we'll get into this.
So I think one problem that almost nobody seems to realize is a problem yet is, although it actually shows up on polls, but I'm not even sure that the people citing this on polls actually realize how big a problem it is. People always say the fiscal deficit is a problem. I'm not sure they know why or what that means, because they said it was a problem back in 2012 when interest rates were really low as well. So maybe they're farsighted and thinking, oh, someday interest rates will rise, or maybe they just think deficit sounds like a bad word. Whatever, among the intellectual classes, I don't see a lot of worry about deficits yet, but it is worrying because our government, when I say we, I mean, actually the United States government is borrowing more money right now, borrowing money at a faster pace relative to GDP, relative to its economy, than it ever has outside of war, depression, or natural disaster. And, natural disaster, including COVID, of course. The economy's humming, everybody has a job, wages are going up, et cetera, and inflation is still above target. Why are we borrowing money at this huge, tremendous rate? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that one reason, probably the main reason, is that we got used to thinking that this was okay, because years and years of very low interest rates convinced us that it wasn't a big problem. And so nobody wanted to do take the political hit of cutting spending or raising taxes when interest rates were still low and we could afford all this debt. Now interest rates are not low, and as long as inflation persists, interest rates are not going back to the extreme low levels they were. So this is a problem because interest costs for our government are now climbing very fast. As we roll over more of our low interest debt to be high interest debt, interest rates are climbing very fast. And a lot of people, including me, thought the Fed was going to start cutting soon, but then the persistence of inflation suggests that the Fed is not going to start cutting very soon. So we're in trouble. We need some austerity. And the question is, should this come from spending cuts or tax increases? And the answer is both. It should come from both. One reason is because spending is now higher than it typically is, and taxes are now lower than they typically are. And both those are relative to GDP. So we are actually in a very low tax situation right now in America, and historically speaking, and we are in a high spending situation, historically speaking. So we're going to need to cut some spending and raise some taxes. And those are both going to be politically painful because no one likes to have their taxes raised and no one likes to have their spending cut. But we're going to have to do both. And so Biden came out with this tax plan for how to raise taxes. And I thought that the broad contours of it were pretty good, but some of the specifics needed a lot of work. And the rhetoric that they used to justify it was kind of weird.
Before getting into the specifics, first, let me ask you, what are we getting for the spending? As you mentioned, we're borrowing at increased amounts, we're spending at increased amounts. Are we getting increasing value from it? Is the money going to transfer payment? How would you characterize that side of the argument?
I think some of the money is going to industrial policy. And I believe personally that that's going to end up being very useful. So some of it's going to, subsidies for battery factories and EVs and chip factories and things like that. That's going to help, hopefully, sort of rebuild American industry, et cetera, in the face of massive Chinese competition, and kind of, also ready us for defense spending, which we need to do. I think that this is spending well spent, because not only does it make our country stronger, but it also creates jobs and blah, blah, blah in the process. So it's something that has tangible benefits in the moment. And it also, has long-term benefits as well. So that's good. But then also the Biden administration has subsidized two of our most overpriced service industries. If you remember that like most important graph in the world that AEI always puts out where it shows like, here's wages and here's like the things that go up faster and here's the things that go up slower than wages. Well, the two things that go up really, really, really fast, or at least have in the past, are higher education and healthcare. And higher education, there's a bit of ambiguity there because it doesn't net out financial aid. But still, higher education is extremely expensive and healthcare is extremely expensive. Those industries employ a lot. And 10 years ago when we were telling cities what they needed to do to grow, the answer was always eds and meds, right? You need universities, you need hospitals. And that's what will make you grow. And that was true. But the thing was that these services got very overpriced. And one reason is because we threw a bunch of money at them. So the way we throw money at higher education primarily, so states have actually cut back on higher education spending. And state universities had to raise tuition. Private universities just kept raising tuition, period. The way we threw money at them was through student loans. So the government, it used to be that private banks would make student loans, right? And then you'd have to pay the bank back. And if you didn't, your credit was bad. It was just like private lending. The government took over all the student loans in the Great Recession. So the government now owns all the student loans. The government makes the student loans. Sometimes with private lenders as a proxy that it then buys the loans off of and blah. But basically the government is making all these loans. And so the government makes the loans and then you have to pay the government back. Now, Biden came along and did student debt cancellation and said, okay, so we're going to make a lot of people not have to pay the government back. Okay, fine. It's a one-time thing. Maybe you can kind of view this as like compensation for the Great Recession. And they kept it so that rich people aren't getting much money back. Poor people are getting, their money back basically. So that's, it's equitable. It's not like just a subsidy for the rich. It's a subsidy for kind of the lower middle class and middle class, the people who went to some years of college but then dropped out and still had to pay back the loans, the sort of losers of the great college boom. And you can say, okay, let's do that one time. But then Biden also implemented an income-based repayment plan where basically if you don't make over a certain amount of money, you don't have to pay the loans back. And the amount of money, the threshold's really high. Other countries have this too, but we are much more generous with this. And so we're basically, and then there's a lot of other ongoing loan forgiveness. So essentially right now with college, we're sort of we're kind of trying to backdoor free college. So essentially this is the thing that the Bernie campaign wanted, and people in the back rooms of the Biden administration are working to sort of get through the back door. And so it's not getting a youth vote necessarily because the youth, care. A few youth care about Palestine, but most youth just care about who care. Most youth just don't care about any of this stuff. And the activists who demanded all this stuff now just care about Palestine. Of course, Biden is being tougher on Israel now too, but nobody's going to give him credit for that. Blah, blah. They're just going to, anyway, I don't like those people. But so basically this is free college through the back door because what happens is the government gives you a loan, then you don't have to pay back the loan. So what happens is that the government gives money to the universities. It's a university subsidy. With healthcare subsidies, we subsidize the healthcare providers via the insurance system. So insurers don't actually make that much money. We give out huge subsidies to insurers, but the insurers pass it on by overpaying for services, paying like $25,000 for a pillow or like 3 times more than you pay out of pocket for an MRI or blah, 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 right? Vastly overpaying for services. These insurers overpay and we're subsidizing them and we're subsidizing the insurers through the government, and Biden has increased health insurance subsidies again and again. And in fact, this plan that he just rolled out wants to increase insurance subsidies. So this spending is largely waste because it's not really making stuff cheaper for, most middle-class people. It's not really lowering the cost burden for people because the money simply goes right into the pocket of the service provider, of the service industry. What it is doing is it's a subsidy to service industries. It is an industrial policy for industries that I do not want to do industrial policies for. I do not think we need to be, subsidizing the healthcare industry, subsidizing the, college industry. We don't need to. Those don't provide the same kind of benefits that subsidizing manufacturing would right now. That's not always true. I think that some subsidies to universities are important to some degree, especially because of the research they do. But I think that we are subsidizing universities too much through the sort of wink, wink, fake loan system. And we are subsidizing healthcare too much through the health insurer subsidies. And this is causing our healthcare to be, even though our healthcare is the same quality as other countries, it's about at least twice the price. And so I don't like this. We ought to cut that spending. And that sounds like we're cutting social spending. It sounds like we're cutting spending on middle class and poor people, which that's not a very progressive, nice thing to do. But in fact, no, what we're actually, because those subsidies get passed through, what we're really doing is we're making those things, we're forcing those things to get cheaper by taking away the subsidies that are allowing them to get bloated and overpriced and expensive. And so I think that spending should be cut. That was a very long preamble to saying, okay, so we also need to raise taxes, right? So if we're going to raise taxes, the people who are getting their taxes raised will probably want to know that we're going to cut spending too. We're not doing that yet. We probably won't do that until maybe if a Republican gets in power, we'll do that. But Donald Trump has certainly not shown any inclination to cut government spending on health care, education, or anything else. Like Donald Trump was not a spending cut guy, right? Like name one spending thing. I mean, occasionally they try to do little cuts to symbolic stuff like the arts or whatever. It's nothing. It's chump change. But that's just to screw the people they don't like. The actual substantive spending cuts, they're not willing to do because they think it's bad electorally. Just like Democrats have been more reluctant than in the past to do large tax increases because they think it's bad electorally. That's a problem because everybody wants to have their cake and eat it too. And if Republicans just want to give tax cuts and Democrats just want to give spending increases, and Republicans refuse to cut spending and Democrats refuse to raise taxes, then we will have a sovereign debt default at some point. So that's bad. But, so we've got to have a political economy that is able to produce, fiscal responsibility at some point. But when interest costs get high, you start to see this happen. So the last time we had austerity was in the early 90s because interest costs got really high. And so that's when, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but when I was a little kid, everyone was concerned about deficits. They put the deficit clock up there, right?
During Clinton or which era?
I think that was during Clinton, yeah. And then, in the 92 election, which I remember watching as a little kid, everyone was talking about deficits. Ross Perot was hammering deficits. George H.W. Bush, who actually raised taxes, breaking his pledge, he wanted to cut deficits. And Bill Clinton, of course, did cut deficits. He did. He really did. He raised taxes quite a bit and he cut spending quite a bit. And that happened. And then we balanced the budget for the first time since forever, right? We balanced the budget under Clinton. Yay.
And was that like a unique time that enabled that would be too difficult today electorally or otherwise?
Well, I don't know because when you get, on the polls, everybody says that one of their main worries is deficits, right? And then when you pull spending cuts and tax increases, they both pull horribly. So it's like saying, like I'm really upset about this infection, but also I really just don't want to take antibiotics. So like I'm fat, but I really love food and I hate working out. So, it's like, I don't know. I don't understand the politics of it because people say contradictory things and no one's really necessarily willing to test those things. Obama and the Tea Party Congress did some austerity, and I'm not sure if it helped either one of them, but Obama did get reelected. So there was that. And anyway, so Biden wants to do tax increases. And so that basically most of the tax increases that he was proposing in this plan, the tax increases he's proposing in this plan are pretty much all about either capital gains or inherited wealth. And I've been advocating those kind of taxes for a long time. So I think higher capital gains taxes are not really dangerous. We've had recently we haven't changed the capital gains tax, but in the past we would raise the rate and lower the rate fairly frequently. And what we see is pretty much no action, nothing happened. We'd raise more money or less money, but in terms of people act like how the market did. So if you're going to raise the capital gains tax and then you pre-announce it, people will pull their money out of the market today to avoid it, right? But in the long term, then there's also this lockup effect, right? Where if you have to pay capital gains taxes, you're not going to sell stock. You're going to keep your stock for longer, right? And that's the lockup effect. I mean, this could be a way of encouraging patient capital. So we always talk about this short-termism, right? Maybe capital gains tax could be a way to fight short-termism. And there's also a reason people don't take their money out of the market. As for whether or not there's this, people are like, oh, well, capital gains taxes disincentivize investment, right? You have higher capital gains taxes. You don't want to do investment. Well, maybe sometimes investment, but not like stocks, because anything else you'd invest your money into, except just cash, will stand to reap capital gains as well. Like you invest your money in bonds, you're just going to pay capital gains tax on that. You invest your money in houses, you're going to pay capital gains tax on that, right? And so the only thing you can really do to avoid the capital gains tax, well, legally, is to consume. Well, you can leave your money in the market for longer, and then you can consume. And the thing is, then, are we really scared that rich people are going to go out and spend their money?
It seems like a good thing, right? We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. If you don't already subscribe to Turpentine's industry-leading newsletters, like our new daily AI newsletter, Emergent Behavior, or Media Empires, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power these newsletters is called Beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business. And they built Beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails. From essayists to business owners, the platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. Beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The Beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, the Lindy newsletter, and so many more. Beehiiv's founder hooked up Moment of Zen listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code MOZ. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started.
I mean, it's a good thing in many ways. Like, it depends on whether or not we need more saving or more spending, but certainly it's going to juice the economy. Like, if rich people go out and buy a whole bunch of mega yachts or whatever they like to buy.
But the concern they have is, or that some people have, is they're going to be less interested in getting rich in the first place if a lot of it's going to be taken. But I assume that you don't think that we're really.
Well, no. So the actual problem with this is not people who have a bunch of money and put it in the stock market, right? It's not the existing rich. The problem is with startups, and you're exactly right. So that's where I was going with this. Capital gains taxes represent in large part sweat equity. And if you raise the capital gains tax high enough, people's sweat equity will go way down. So you have a bunch of, most businesses fail. And a lot of people do a business that adds a bit of value, and then they end up cashing out for about what their wage would have been. And so by raising the capital gains tax rate on that income of those people to what it would be for ordinary income, you're basically saying there's no real equivalent between a startup and a job if that's the expected outcome. And then people are going to take the low risk option, which is a job. So you're going to disincentivize, risk taking. And the idea is, we've had this big boom in startup formation. We've had this big boom in high growth tech company formation. You might think that there's a startup bust, but in fact, there is not. There is a fundraising crunch. But in terms of people actually trying to start businesses, there's more than ever. And that's true of small businesses too. But startups make their money on capital gains. Carving out part of the capital gains tax for startups would be a good idea. But capital gains taxes in general are pretty good, because most of the wealth out there, most of the existing wealth out there is just like a bunch of rich people sitting on stocks and expensive land. That's it. Like, there's no reason not to tax that at the same rate. There's no reason you should get a preferential tax rate to click buy on an index fund, and why that income that you get from that, the capital gain you get from watching your index fund go up after clicking a button, there's no reason why the income from that should be taxed at a lower rate than the income you get from going to work every day and slaving away for hours a day for years. There's no reason for that. So I'm sorry. There's absolutely, we do not need to encourage more people to click buy on a Vanguard index fund so much that we starve our government of tax revenue and run giant deficits. I'm sorry. No, tax that. But startups are a different matter.
That makes sense. Should we get to the inheritance part?
Yeah. So the inheritance part, basically, one really ridiculous loophole in the capital gains tax is that if you never sell your assets and then you leave them to somebody when you die, that capital gain never gets taxed, and that income just never gets taxed. It vanishes into the ether. So Biden, that's called the step-up basis loophole. And if, you're like, is it a loophole? Yes, because when you look at tax planning people, they all have a big banner saying loophole, step up basis loophole. How can I take advantage of the step up basis loophole? Say 1,000 financial planning websites. Yes, it's a loophole. And there's no reason for it. There's no reason why a capital gain, why income shouldn't get taxed just because it's your dad's income. Right? When you inherit this money, when you inherit these assets, you should only, you should have to sell some portion of them to pay for the amount that they went up. Right? That you should have to do that. You should there will always be enough to pay those taxes by definition because it's a capital gains tax, not a capital tax. Right? If you inherit, $1 million of stock, right? And that stock went up from $500,000, you'll owe capital gains tax on $500,000. Fine. But since you inherited $1 million, you can pay the tax on $500,000. You can. Mathematically, you'll always be able to pay this tax. So there's no one who'll whatever. If you inherit a property, you might have to sell that property. But Biden, not wanting people to have to sell their houses, is giving some exemptions for homeowners who have under a certain amount of assets, blah, 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 blah. So it's okay, grandma won't have to, grandma leaves you her house. You don't have to sell the house to pay capital gains tax. Okay. It's just it's trying to get at people with stocks. Rich people own most of the stocks in this country. Rich people own, 80% of the stocks or something like that. I don't remember. And then stocks are most of rich people's wealth. And so it's basically trying to tax that. So that's that. And that's just a really good thing to do. Inherited wealth is in general negative for society. Yes, I understand you worked really hard to build your company and now you want to build a dynasty, and you can still build that dynasty just a little less.
And why is it negative for America?
Well, because then we become a country where inequality is frozen in. And the more inequality is frozen in, the less that people who started from nothing have the chance to climb their way to the top of the ladder, right? Then the more that top of the ladder is occupied by essentially aristocrats, inherited wealth, the less drive and mobility, the less of a mobile society people will feel like we have, right? Why do people start startups? It's not just so that they can get a dollar number. It's so they can get to the top class of society. But if the top class of society is clogged with the kids of super rich people.
So there'll be a less dynamic society, less people even trying to rise up, and that will, somehow show itself in the economy somehow.
Yeah. And it'll just make people feel that America is dominated by heirs. There's massive support for taxing inherited wealth.
Are there any stats of how people who inherit wealth, do we know how they spend? Are they productive? Are they more productive? Are they less productive? Because, there are the stereotypes that, hey, every third generation or.
Well, one thing is they give a lot of it away. If they're really rich, they invest it unproductively. They're not very good investors. Often they're bums. So a lot of these people just live off the money for their life and just don't do work. Great. Well, you know what? If you come from money and you have parents who were brilliant entrepreneurs who are able to make all this money, you probably have inherited talent, whether it's inherited genetically or whether your parents just taught you, how to run a business, or, you have network capital because your family's business connections. You should be able to do stuff, right? Instead of just sitting around being a bum for the rest of your life. So make those people with the human capital work for it. Make them use their entrepreneurial talents, to produce something for society. And so there's actually some, economic models showing that that's economically efficient as long as you use the revenue for something efficient, blah, blah, blah. But then, so basically taxing inherited wealth, good idea. There's another random thing that there's also an increased tax on inherited wealth in there, that also good. The worst idea in the Biden plan is taxing unrealized gains. So this is you put 100,000 in the stock market, it goes up to 200,000, but you don't sell it. Now they're going to make you pay taxes on it anyway. First of all, this will make the market go down because it'll force everybody to sell. So the whole reason capital gains doesn't take money out of the market is because of the lockup, right? You avoid capital gains tax by leaving your money in the stock and letting it appreciate for longer. Well, if you tax unrealized gains, that's the opposite, right? You have to take your money out. You have to sell stuff to pay it. So that's not necessarily good. This is even worse for startups. You can't sell like part of your startup. You just can't do it. Your startup is unrealized gains, but like there's no liquid market, right? You'd have to take a huge hit or sell on a secondary market. It would just be, disastrous. So it's dumb. It shows that some people in the Biden administration aren't thinking carefully about this. But even in general, taxing unrealized gains will just cause people to take money out of the market. It'll cause inventories of unsold real estate churn in the real estate market. It's just, the point is that the income is getting taxed through capital gains. There's no reason, it's not actual income until you sell it. I can borrow against it using it as collateral and spend today, but then I have to pay that money back, right, with interest. So that's not actual income. It's not income until you get the money that you can spend, right? And if you have Apple shares, and I've just been sitting on these Apple shares and I'm not going to sell them because I don't want to pay the capital gains tax. If you're sitting on those Apple shares and you have all these unrealized gains, you can't buy anything with those Apple shares. You can't get a house. You can't get a car. You can't get, whatever. Like an NFT, collectible NFT. You can't do it. You can't just swap stock shares for stuff. That's not how it works. And so it's not income. And so that's why this doesn't make a lot of sense. It would actually make markets go down. People would get mad because their pensions and whatever nest eggs would go down. Everyone, blah, blah. So that's a bad idea. But the basic idea of taxing capital gains at a higher rate, and at least on, assets that are not startups, and also taxing inherited wealth. These are good ideas, but the ideas of taxing unrealized gains in startups, these are bad ideas. And so there's some good ideas in here. It has the bones of a good plan, but then it adds some stupid stuff, which obviously, some progressives just put in there and thought no one would really notice, but they did, because people always notice. And you just make people mad. That plan's never going to pass in that form. All it did was make people mad, especially because the rhetoric they used to justify it was very odd. They said, okay, the purpose of all this is to close racial wealth gaps. Well, no. The purpose is, no one's going to vote for that. No one thinks I don't like racial wealth gaps, but no one thinks they should be policy's primary target. No one thinks that like closing racial wealth gaps is like the main thing our policy should be trying to do. Like capital gains tax is not reparations. Okay. And there's no sense in which that makes any sense. So that rhetoric was misplaced and is going to piss people off. So whoever's writing this plan did not have enough input from outside their team, right? It was a badly written plan, but it has some good things in it. And Biden is right that taxes are going to need to go up. And I hope that people recognize that the era of low tax, high spend must end, and that it's going to end with both spending coming down and taxes going up.
Can you talk about what are the other types of taxes that are levers and the various sort of pros and cons, or maybe they're all bad ideas that Biden, in addition to or instead of capital gains tax, as an example?
We can raise income tax. Income tax it doesn't really cause many people to stop working. Rich people work hard and they don't start getting lazy when you tax their income higher unless you tax their income at such ridiculous rates that they're going to be hiding it all anyway. Like if you tax income at like 80% or something, yeah, people are going to, you're going to have a less motivated society. But if you raise taxes from, marginal tax rates from like, 35 to 40% or something like that, people don't really stop working very much. And so that's, you can raise income taxes. I favor raising income taxes on not just the rich, but also on the middle class and upper middle class. I think we ought to pay for our stuff, but that's not popular. Yeah, the Wall Street Journal always says, "Oh, it's you people who are paying making between 200K and 500K. You're a big tax target. They're going to tax you." And the Democrats are like, "No, we're not going to tax anybody making under 400K a year." And then like, "No, you should. You should tax them higher." A more egalitarian society is good, and I favor having higher tax rates at the top because also we're going to need to do additional spending on military stuff. People don't realize that yet. They don't realize the risk of war. They don't realize we're going to need to do a military buildup and it's going to cost money, but we're going to need to pay for that because we can't just keep doing all this deficit spending. So we're going to need to pay for military buildup with higher taxes, and people are going to have to understand. We need leadership to sell people on the need to do these difficult things.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Over 100 startups launched today. Do you know who they are? If you're not seeing interesting startups, none of your downstream processes matter. How you source deals at the earliest stages could be your most consequential investment. Harmonic is the most complete startup database, finding new companies as soon as they incorporate and tracking them through IPO. You can create a search tailored to your investment thesis. In one search, filter over company data, including venture stage, industry, and geography, founders and operators' backgrounds, and traction metrics like headcount changes, social media audience, and web traffic growth. Importantly, Harmonic instantly surfaces warm connections to help you connect with founders. The results are delivered on autopilot, wherever you most need them, over Slack, email, or via API, directly into your CRM, integrating seamlessly into your software stack. Learn why Craft, Bedrock, NEA, and hundreds more trust Harmonic's data by visiting harmonic.ai or use the link in the description. Make sure you mention our podcast, Turpentine VC, during your demo. This actually relates to a listener question that David Galkowski has, which is, he asks, or what do you think about a progressive wage subsidy as an alternative to UBI? Although these aren't much of a concern in our current full employment economy, we'd get to recapture some deadweight lost caused by minimum wages and protect against job losses from technological change. People seem to get psychological value out of feeling productive and earning their way over and above being able to cover their material needs, a positive externality to employment that UBI wouldn't capture.
I think that is right. But of course, there's some people who can't work, right? So we actually have a couple of wage subsidies in the form of the so-called trapezoid programs, the EITC and the child tax credit. EITC and CTC have a phase-in where the more you make, the more you get. So it's an impetus to work, and it's also an incentive for companies to hire people. We can increase that. And if you're worried about robots going to take all our jobs, well then wage subsidy is a useful way to stop that from happening, right? So wage subsidy is a good idea, but there's a lot of people who aren't going to be covered by it, right?
What do you think about harbinger taxes?
What do you mean by those?
Oh, my understanding of harbinger taxes are like taxes on land or increased land tax.
Oh, land tax, of course, that's very good. That's how localities should fund themselves. So California needs to eliminate Prop 13 and raise property tax. The difference in a land tax and a property tax is not big. The difference in a land tax and a property tax is just an incentive for development. So you can have a property tax with property tax rebates for developments. So like if you build a development like an apartment building somewhere, you get money back that you don't have to pay on property tax. That is a land tax. And by the way, we should call it a Henry George tax.
Oh yeah. That's what I meant. Okay, so we alluded to this in this podcast already, and you wrote a post about how some leftists are being active pro-Palestinian supporters, or pro-Hamas rather, and this is different from things like Vietnam because the pro-Hamas case is not a peace movement; it's a war movement, and so it's unlikely that 50 years from now the supporters of sort of Hamas or sympathizers for them will earn our sympathy in the same way that people supporting Vietnam 50 years before, or 50 years ago rather, have. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. There were a few Vietnam War protesters who actually supported, the Viet Cong and said we need communists to conquer Washington D.C. and blah blah. Those people were being kind of silly, and I think they sort of knew that they were being silly and playing around. There was a lightheartedness to much of that because I think they thought that was so beyond the pale that they're basically just, clowning, that they're basically just tweaking the tail of the powers that be.
Whereas this one seems more serious to you?
This one seems more serious. Now there were a few serious people who would love to overthrow the United States and bring in communism, start a revolution. The Weathermen, asked like ex-Viet Cong people in Cuba, like, how do we do this? How do we start a communist revolution in America? And they were like, you know what they said? What? They said, you don't. They said, the conditions are not right for revolution in America.
Of course.
Everyone is kind of rich.
Yeah.
That's not why people rebel. And so the Viet Cong were like, and also you're like a bunch of soft middle-class kids who would never make it as revolutionaries. Fuck off. So they fucked off. And, then they went and all became like academics and raised Chesa Boudin. But then, but most of the Vietnam War protests were anti-war. They just wanted to stop this war.
Yeah, so I guess that's where the sympathy 50 years later is with the idea that it was not that the Viet Cong were right or whatever, or Vietnam was right, but just that the war was dumb. Like we shouldn't. Yeah.
And the same with Iraq. The idea that like we want nobody in Iraq war protests, or almost nobody, was saying we want the American army to be defeated. Yes, empire is defeated by the glorious ISIS. Or no, people didn't say that. But anyway, we won the Iraq war, by the way. People don't like to admit that, but it's true. It was not worth it to go to war. It was not a good war. It was bad, but we won.
What does winning mean?
We kicked everyone's ass and established like a puppet state and pacified the country.
But not in Afghanistan?
No, we did not. In Afghanistan, we basically occupied it, but we could not get people to give up the idea that they wanted to be ruled by Taliban. We could get people to give up the idea that they wanted to be ruled by Saddam or ISIS or whatever in Iraq. Instead, they're ruled by like some, local pseudo-democratic thuggish government that will probably give America what we want if we push them. And that's all we got out of that war. It was not a useful victory, and a lot of people died, and we shouldn't have done it. We gave up our moral standing in the world stage and unleashed an era of conquest and tore up many of the norms that we had worked so hard to build up since World War II. And it was shitty and dumb, and George Bush was one of the worst presidents ever, but we won. Yeah, win. Anyway, I think people just have to come to terms with the idea that winning a war doesn't always make the war worth it. And I think that World War I taught this to a lot of European powers. Like Britain and France won the war, but they didn't come out ahead. No one says that Britain and France lost World War I, right? But they became much poorer, and they lost much of their international standing. And that was what ended them as major world empires, although it didn't happen immediately. But World War I set them on an irrevocable course toward imperial collapse. And yet they won. They won the war.
In a different kind of way, is it fair to say that the Arab Spring also hasn't been much of a success in terms of people, the countries being stronger as a result of it, even though it was heralded as this great accomplishment?
I don't know if people heralded it as a great accomplishment. I think very quickly people said like, "Oh God, it's the whole region is engulfed in flames." Yeah, so I think that's not really a comparable situation, because that was just a whole bunch of different wars, sort of a regional wave of war. Anyway, yeah, so pro-war, like Palestine protesters are not going to be remembered well by history, and because we've seen this before with intifadas and stuff like that. The problem is that there's a whole bunch of leftists around the world who want to fight Israel to the last Palestinian. They want to egg on Palestinians to do not accept a two-state solution. Fight, Palestinians, fight to the end, and yet they're never the ones who do the dying, right? And then they're like, "Oh God, Israel's so horrible, bombing them and blah blah blah," and Israel is pretty brutal, and that's bad, and especially Netanyahu, bad dude. But who was the one who told the Palestinians that Israel was almost dead? You're about to kill them. They're about to crumble any day. All the Jews are going to go to Brooklyn and Poland, and they're all going to leave.
Miami
they're
Beach.
They're not native to this region. They're just a bunch of interlopers. They're all going to leave tomorrow if you just kill a few more of them and bomb a few more buses and slaughter a few more families, blah, blah, instead of just beating the living fuck out of you. Like all the leftists, the international left, and some international diaspora as well. And like, I don't know, the Pakistani diaspora in Britain for some reason, like all these people, and some Palestinian diaspora too, but not all, only a minority, I think. But some foreigners who never do the dying egg on the Palestinians to fight, kill, kill, kill. They want to fight to the last Palestinian. And that's what annoys me so much about these pro-war protests, because the people who do the dying are the poor Palestinians themselves and Israelis who get killed. And while the people who scream bloody murder from Columbia campus don't suffer any consequences other than maybe getting your dorm cafeteria card cut off. When all these people are like, I was left without food. Yes, that means they stopped serving you in the dorm cafeteria because you were, breaking into shit. Well, oh no. You're tortured. Your meal plan was cut off. It's torture. I hate these people.
Why do you call it the new 1970s?
So in the 1970s, you had a lot of people who. So in the late 60s, starting around 1965, starting in the Watts riot, and then continuing into Vietnam protests and many more riots and other kinds of protests as well, various leftist activism, and then terrorism too, leftist terrorism. You had this big leftist upheaval in America. And when I say leftist, I don't, you had upheaval of everything from hippies to communists, and those weren't all the same people, obviously. You had a lot of people who just wanted the Vietnam War to end. Those people were good. Those were my parents. They were anti-war protesters, and so you had that. And then in the 70s, things started to cool down. So you had Nixon got kicked out. Well, he massively won re-election, which made people sort of despair of, the kind of Bernie Sanders-esque electoral stuff that they were trying at the time with McGovern, Eugene McCarthy, and then McGovern. Very similar to the Sanders campaign. So you had that discourage them. Then Nixon got kicked out, so there wasn't Nixon to get mad at and kick around anymore. There's only stupid old Ford and Carter. And then after that, you had the Vietnam War ended. We got out of Vietnam. And then, so there wasn't that to make people mad. We increased welfare spending a shit ton. And, that addressed a lot of the really bad ghetto conditions that had prevailed in Black America. And so that helped improve things. And you had a huge increase in crime. But that was not something, that was just something that people viewed as like that made people more reactionary, right? The big increase in crime. But so the increase in crime, and then inflation came and it refocused people on economic problems. Note all the similarities to today. Trump's out. If Trump comes back, maybe we'll get BLM 3.0 or 2.0 or whatever we're on now. So if Trump comes back, we might get that. Protests are sort of dying down. But the thing is that the hardcore people stay and they get even wackier because when the two reasons. Number one, composition effect. So when the moderate people leave the movement, the hardcore people are left. And so by definition, the movement says more hardcore extremist things. And you're seeing that with Palestine right now. The Palestine protests are a small fraction of, what the size of the BLM protests. Because of that, it's the hardcore protester types. And so they tend to be more extreme. And so also you don't have the moderating effect. You don't have the interaction effect of the moderates, exerting a moderating influence on the extremists around them and say, no, guys, we can't say Hamas is good. Except now that they're gone. They're back to school, back to work, back to K-pop and TikTok and whatever they love. They're just like, okay, the world got too crazy. I'm just going to check out for a bit. Some of them think they failed. Some of them think they won. Some of them just don't care. And so as the normies filter away, the crazies get more crazy because they're egging each other on in this tiny bubble of increasing crazy. So it's like evaporative cooling or escape velocity. It's like you shed all this propellant mass of normies and then the crazies have this little capsule of escape velocity. How's that? The rocketry analogy of crazy.
I want to segue to some audience questions and do some rapid fire. Does that sound good?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. Jacob Friedman has a question on the German economy. He asks, what did Germany do right in the past to be able to manufacture despite high wages? And why is it struggling so much now?
Well, one thing it did was that high wages, yes, but then German unions exercised wage restraint, which is to say that when international competition was severe, German unions would say, okay, we're willing to restrict our wages, in order for German companies to maintain competitiveness and preserve market share or gain market share in global export markets for manufacturing. So they had a long-term cooperative, and then the union was rewarded because wages go up at a slow, steady rate instead of a big bump today. And the unions also maintained employment levels. So when you kill the goose, when you raise today's wages or more often pension demands so much today that the company just goes bankrupt, you don't get your wages, you don't get your pensions in the future, and nobody else does either. But here, the unions were able to preserve themselves over time by exercising wage restraint that allowed Germany to maintain export market share for the long term. In addition, Germany has a very robust system of vocational education for manufacturing, which increased the productivity of a bunch of its manufacturing workers by teaching them how to operate a bunch of machines. That raised their productivity. And when you have higher productivity, you can afford to pay workers more. So those two things, wage restraint and vocational education, were why Germany was able to preserve a manufacturing export market share at a high rate, pretty high wage rate. And the third thing, I guess, is investment in automation and robotics. That increases productivity. And because Germany, promoted exports heavily, they were able to gain export share and not lay off a ton of manufacturing workers, even though they were automating. They were getting robots. Robots make your industry more competitive. Without robots, your manufacturing industry is going to wither and die. So we could take a page out of all these books. We could have better vocational education. We could have more robots, and we could have unions that have a long-term cooperative relationship with their companies instead of a short-term adversary relationship.
That is a good overview. I want to go to now our listener, Christopher May, who has a question on Japan. He asks, Japan has had both high levels of government debt and deflation historically. Why could the government not just print yen to pay down that debt and cause inflation at the same time?
It did. That's what it did. The government printed yen to put the debt on the books of the central bank. It didn't pay it. It just hid it. It just took it away. And when the government formally has to pay interest to the central bank, but the central bank simply gives all its extra money back to the government. So you don't really pay interest on that debt. So it did exactly what you're saying. Could it do more? Maybe. One problem is that when you do this, your currency goes down. And Japan's currency is incredibly weak. So Japan has a ton of debt, and low interest rates. One reason interest rates are staying low in Japan, one reason the Bank of Japan isn't raising interest rates more, is because that would massively raise the government's interest costs, and it doesn't want to do that, because then you'd either have to raise taxes or blah, blah, whatever, or cut spending on old people. Japan actually spends money pretty efficiently these days. It mostly just spends money on old people, and it does it in a pretty efficient way. So you'd have to cut spending, really hurting a lot of old people, or you'd have to raise taxes, which would hurt a lot of young people. So you keep interest rates low. But the problem with that is the interest rates are higher in America, so the bond investors are fleeing the yen, right? They're selling yen and they're buying dollars so they can buy American bonds, which yield more than Japanese bonds. In addition, so if you just print yet more money to pay off the debt, or to hide the debt in this case, which is if amounts to the same thing, you weaken the yen even more, and then Japan imports all its food and fuel, right? Not all, but most. Japan imports most of its food and fuel, and with a weaker currency, Japanese people can't afford food and fuel. Japanese companies can't afford fuel to run themselves. And so then you're in trouble, your industry is in trouble, your economy is in trouble, your people's consumption is in trouble. So that's why.
Makes sense. Thank you for the question. This one's from Eric Kirshner. Eric asked, the S&P 500 has an average annual growth rate of roughly 10%. However, GDP generally grows at about 2 to 3%. How is it possible that these two measures have a wide discrepancy on average? Is it increasing amount of U.S. corporate capitalization speculative? Is it more of the U.S. economy being dominated by public companies? Or is there just higher demand for stocks?
That's a great question. First of all, a slight correction. The 2 to 3% GDP number is real GDP, while the 10% number is nominal S&P appreciation. You want to use real there. In terms of real, it's maybe a little less than 7%. So around 7. So you're looking at a 7% to 2.5% discrepancy instead of a 10% to 2.5% discrepancy. It's still a big discrepancy. This is what is called the equity premium. Why is there an equity premium? Well, for a long time, there was an equity premium because demand went up, because more pension funds were allowed to invest in stock. And it became easier for normal people to put their money in the stock market. So they did. So demand increased. Another reason that the equity premium happened was because profit margins went up, right? Companies became more profitable, partly by selling overseas, partly through monopoly power, probably. And so profit margins increased. So that increased stock values faster. Interest rates went down for a long time. That will also cause assets to appreciate faster than the rate of GDP, because then you can discount your cash flows over a longer horizon. And so your values are higher. And so those three things were three long-term sort of secular forces pushing demand up. But what will be the propeller now? What will happen now? I don't know. Everyone, there's many ages in which people are like, okay, guys, equity premium's done. Equity, will drop a bit. Now, I will say that one long-term reason for the equity premium is risk compensation. So back in the days of the World War II generation, normal people didn't invest any money in stocks pretty much, because it was just all risky, and they remember the crash of the Great Depression and blah, blah. Those days slowly ended. But if you look at normal people, they still have most of their wealth in houses, not stocks. There's still actually lots of room for people to move money out of real estate into the stock market if they want. And so that might happen. That is a way that we could get a long-term equity premium. Foreigners buying more US stocks is another way you can get a long-term equity premium. Things like that. Yeah, so there's other ways we could get the equity premium could continue to hold up in the future. It's just fewer and fewer as time goes by, and at some point the amount will have to drop. But because people are so scared of stocks, you can have a sort of century-long or longer, sort of risk-based catch-up as people gradually over decades and decades learn not to fear stocks as much.
Thank you, Eric, for the question. This question is from Thomas Evans. Are you worried about the effects of algorithmic pricing on competition?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, algorithmic pricing can do something called first-degree price discrimination, which is technically illegal, but much harder to enforce in an algorithmic age. Algorithms, if they know enough about you, can recommend a personalized price that's exactly whatever you're willing to pay, and then milk each consumer so that, in fact, Uber might already be doing this. We're not sure. It probably deserves investigation, but compare poor people and rich people and what they pay in Ubers. Try the same route next to each other. People who make different amounts of money. See what you get. Maybe it'll be no effect. Maybe it'll be an effect. I don't know, but Uber could do this. They say they don't. It's also illegal, I believe. Amazon got caught doing it earlier in their life and then stopped because they were going to be shut down. But they can. Amazon can, Jeff Bezos knows everything about you. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been good or bad, so be good for goodness sake. He also delivers all the presents via airmail on Christmas Eve, and he employs a large workforce working in underpaid, frigid conditions. Jeff Bezos is Santa Claus. Santa Claus was real the whole time. He'd probably come down your chimney and bang your mom, too. Eat all your cookies.
Even if you're Jewish.
No, right. Then you just get a lump of coal. But Jeff Bezos is still happy to hook up with your mom. Have you seen the muscles on that guy? He's TRT, baby. Anyway, no, I respect Jeff Bezos because, when he got divorced as a middle-aged man, he went for his sort of middle-class personal trainer girlfriend. He's like, that's who I feel like dating because I'm super rich and I can date whoever I want, because he just doesn't care. When you actually have fuck you money, the way you want to tell the world to fuck you is by not dating models and starlets and whatever, just dating your personal trainer or whatever. That's what you want to do. So do it. Which gets to the point that most people actually don't. What most people actually want in terms of consumption has very little to do with what they try to get for status reasons. But that's a topic for another post and another day. I forgot what we were talking about. It really got off track.
Yeah, once we got to Bezos banging mom,
just derailed the heck out of this podcast.
It was algorithmic pricing.
Right, algorithmic pricing. The other thing that can happen is algorithmic collusion. There's plenty of papers showing how algorithms, by adjusting their prices and just only by observing the ways in which the other algorithmically priced things are adjusting, they can figure out, they can sort of game theory themselves automatically into an above market price, into collusion, price fixing by accident. How do you stop that? I don't know.
Thank you, Thomas, for the question. This last question is from Will DeAndre. Will says, I know this isn't the typical fan question, but I would love to know where Noah consumes his news. Love the podcast and both of you guys. How does Noah know so much?
Well, I consume news on Substacks. There's a lot of great Substacks out there. A lot of good blogs. I consume news on Twitter, unfortunately, although it's getting worse for this purpose, but it's still somewhat useful. I, consume news on Google News.
Let me reframe the question. If someone wants to be as knowledgeable as you, besides putting in the time.
Right. First, give up your life and give up your social life and give up your career. And then you too. Yes.
No, you have a great career in social life.
Oh, thank you. It's because we always go to the same party. That's why.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Well, you're saying I have a great social life because that means by proxy, it means you have a great social life.
Yes, exactly.
Which is probably true. All right. Anyway, but so how do we become as well informed as me? A lot of it has to do with knowing what to read and what not to read. over time, your diet improves because you understand who knows what they're talking about and what the good sources are. And that's not something I can very easily convey to some degree. Like some of that's from like getting a PhD. I'll actually know, economics writing that's just like herp de derp. I read MMT and now I'm an expert on macro kind of bullshit from like, someone who actually knows how like markets work. So, I can tell that at a glance, right? And going to grad school really helped. Although also reading, over time, but the problem with reading people to learn is that when you read pundits, you can read the dumbest people on earth, and then you think you're getting smarter when you're actually getting dumber by reading them. And this could even be me. Maybe I'm dumb about something, or maybe everything. Maybe I'm just really dumb, and it's all just been a hoax the whole time. So you never quite know. And so learning by reading blogs, you might read the wrong blogs and come up with some wrong stuff. So having some technical background and some technical knowledge really does help you, assimilate things. But I would say consume a varied diet. Read people on all different sides of things and observe them arguing with each other, observe them disagreeing, and compare how well they support their stuff.
Yeah, that's something I've seen you do well. You're able to articulate arguments on various different sides, various different camps, and then come to your own conclusion. So I think that's a good.
I don't often do the steel manning thing because often for really dumb things, it's just an unreasonable demand. Like, I'm not going to argue why, like, okay, first I'm going to steel man the case that Jews killed Jesus and then tell you why they didn't really kill Jesus. Okay, fine. I don't always steel man things, but then, I can do it. It's not difficult. And sometimes it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap on that. Thanks for all the questions. Please keep submitting them. We'll keep going through them as we also go through Noah's pieces. Noah, thanks for another great episode. I'll see you next week.
All right. See you soon.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and eriktorenberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.